that piece is in our hymnals. And in our hymnals, it's called Joyful, Joyful, We Adore Thee. And there are words by a man named Van Dyck, and it's often used in Christian weddings. The music, however, is by this man, Ludwig van Beethoven. It was set to a poem by Friedrich Schiller, who was a great German historian and poet. Now, it's important to remember that this man, Ludwig van Beethoven, was a Van Beethoven, not a von Beethoven, as people often think. His family was from Belgium. His grandfather, also Ludwig van Beethoven, had been a great musician and had become the Kapellmeister of the court of Bonn. Now, Kapellmeister is a fancy German way of saying music director. He led the choir, he did arrangements, and he did performances. He had one son, Johann van Beethoven, who he was very disappointed in. Johann was kind of undisciplined. He was a fine singer and had a lovely voice, but he didn't practice much. However, his father, the Kapellmeister, got him a position in the court as a singer and arranged for him to give lessons to the children of nobility. Now, Johann, as I say, was not very disciplined and often didn't make his father happy. He fell in love with the daughter of a cook. Her name was Maria. The Kapellmeister said, "I don't want you to marry her. She's not of the station that you should marry." However, he went ahead and married her anyway, which one might say, bad move, Johann. They had 7 children. Only 3 survived. Their first child was Ludwig Marie van Beethoven. Ludwig Marie died 6 days after birth. This was bad news again for Johann because he'd hoped to ingratiate himself with his father by naming the boy after him. Well, a year later, they have another son, and this becomes Ludwig van Beethoven, the composer, the man whose picture is here. Now, 4 years after that, the Kapellmeister dies. Johann, as his son, believes the job will just pass to him. It does not. He becomes a very disillusioned and embittered man when he discovers his father, the Kapellmeister Ludwig van Beethoven, did not even write him a good letter of recommendation. At this point, he begins drinking heavily. He does recognize that his son, Ludwig van Beethoven, who is now only 4, is a musical prodigy. He's giving him piano lessons. He often comes home late at night, very drunk, pulls the child out of bed, makes him stand on a piano stool and play the piano, and if he does not play well, boxes his ears and slaps him. Eventually, Beethoven, well, we should say Ludwig, began to hate his father. His father now began having a very hard time supporting the family because he lost most of his students. When you're drunk a lot and your temper is terrible, people don't want you teaching their children. But he looked at his son, who was a child prodigy and was now 7, and decided to introduce him to the Elector of Bonn, which is like the prince. However, to make him seem more like Mozart, who had started his career at the age of 5, he told everyone Ludwig was 5, which was easy because Ludwig was small for his age. So shortly after that, Beethoven is indeed hired by the Elector, and it begins playing the piano, playing the organ, singing in the choir. And by the time he's a teenager, he's now supporting the family because his father has now been not really fired, but pensioned off because he's no longer of use to the court. At one point, Ludwig approaches the prince and says, my father is drinking all of his pension. Please give half his pension to me so that I can support my mother and 2 brothers. So this happens, and the Elector of Bonn happily does that. But then he also decides, when Ludwig is 16, that he's a very progressive prince, and he will send Ludwig to Vienna to study with the great master Haydn, and to perhaps even study with Mozart. So Haydn becomes Beethoven's teacher. At first, Haydn, who's an old man now, but well-loved by everyone in Vienna, he's called Papa Haydn by his orchestra and most of his students. At first, he doesn't really know if he likes Beethoven, because Beethoven is very much a revolutionary. He's very much trying to break away from the system of composition then. He also resents nobility. He does not approve of what's called the patronage system, where someone like a prince becomes your patron and tells you what to compose and when to compose it. Beethoven does not like this. But eventually, Haydn and Beethoven become the best of friends. He plays for Mozart, and Mozart doesn't have incredibly good things to say about Beethoven, although he does say he's a man to watch. At this time, he also meets a woman named Nanette Streicher. Now, one of my friends immediately said, was she the immortal beloved? Because there's a movie called that. No, Nanette Streicher was a piano maker, which is very unusual in that time period. She had inherited her father's piano factory and became a good friend of Beethoven's. Later, after his mother died, she almost became his surrogate mother. She would often help him find places to stay, because he was often being thrown out of his lodgings for being disruptive and loud. She also would find servants for him because he couldn't keep employees. He was unpredictable, he was angry. He would desist they do things and yell at them. So she also would sometimes go in and clean his apartment for him. She also provided him with pianos. So the big thing now about Beethoven, well, first of all, his physical description. Beethoven was not quite 5 feet 4 inches tall. He was a broad stature. He was a big man in that sense. He was very much impressed by Napoleon Bonaparte, who was also 5 feet 4 inches tall. He admired him greatly and composed pieces and dedicated them to him. However, when Napoleon Bonaparte declared himself emperor, this just enraged Ludwig van Beethoven. He destroyed all of those dedications and destroyed some of the pieces as well. Now, in his mid-20s, Beethoven began noticing that he was having hearing loss in his left ear. He was embarrassed by this at first because he didn't want people to think there was something wrong with him. And also, as a musician, he felt he needed to have perfect hearing. Also, people didn't really understand what caused deafness at that time. Now, here's a quote from Beethoven at the age of 26. He wrote to one of his friends, "My hearing grows worse and worse. I don't hear the high notes of the instruments, and voices sometimes I cannot hear people who speak quietly. I can hear the sounds they make, but not their words. My ears, they still keep buzzing and humming day and night, and if someone yells, it is unbearable to me." In fact, Beethoven winds up being put in jail because someone is whistling near him while he's walking, and without even thinking of it, he takes his walking stick and hits the man on the head. Well, he only spent one night in jail, but that was all right. In 1802, Beethoven is very depressed by the loss of his hearing, and he is contemplating suicide. He writes a long letter to his brothers, which he never mailed them. But in it, he does say that he decides that he's going to live. He's going to seize fate by the throat, and it shall certainly not crush me. And in 1806, he wrote on one of his musical compositions, "Let your deafness no longer be a secret, even in art." So how did Beethoven continue to compose after his deafness? Well, first of all, he had been able to hear. He was a fine singer. He played many instruments, including the piano. And so he knew the ranges of all these instruments and what notes they could produce. He knew what would fit under the hands of the performers. So he continued to do that. He also had devices that friends made for him. One friend took a long metal rod and fastened it to the harp inside his piano, and then had it rest on Beethoven's shoulder so he could feel the vibrations. Another gave him a long wooden baton, which he held between his teeth and put against the music stand of the piano. Later, he even had the legs sawn off of one of his pianos, so it would be on the floor, and he could use the floor as a resonator so he could hear it better. Now, because of all of this and the pounding he would do on pianos, he did often have to move to new lodgings. He also, at this time period, began to no longer notice how he dressed. He was often seen in Vienna walking, wearing filthy clothing. He also was picked up as a vagrant once because he fell asleep on a park bench in Vienna, and the police, not recognizing him, thought that he was a bum. One of his friends had to come and get him out of jail. He was, however, still a happy person in a way. He enjoyed his food, he enjoyed his wine, and he was often seen at the local bistro enjoying himself. Now, we come on to March 26, 1827. Okay, that is the day that Beethoven dies. Beethoven had been in a coma for about 3 or 4 days. For the last few months of his life, he'd been in terrible pain from abdominal problems. At 5 p.m. on March 26th, there was a flash of lightning and a clap of thunder. And one of his friends wrote, "Beethoven opened his eyes, lifted his right hand, and looked up for several seconds with his fist closed. Not another breath, not a heartbeat more." And then Beethoven died. So this leads some people to believe that even on his deathbed, Beethoven could still hear. But what could he hear? About 2 years before his death, Clementi, who was another composer and also a piano maker, had made something called the forte piano, the loudest piano in the world, and presented it to Beethoven. And Clementi said he thought Beethoven could hear. Could he hear? Or had he learned how to lip read? Had he learned how to interpret what people were doing? We don't know. And now we return back to the Ode to Joy. Oh, and I should mention, I brought a book called Beethoven's Hair, which I don't know if you'll be able to see. It's very interesting. After Beethoven died, now he's on his deathbed, within a few moments, his doctors remove part of his skull because they want to see what the inside of his ears look like, to see if they can tell what caused the deafness. After that, a death mask is made and casts of his hands. So if you ever see his death mask, which you can see on Wikipedia, Beethoven doesn't look the same. This part of his head is shrunken in, giving him a very prominent forehead. But the other thing that happened after his complete autopsy, where they could not discover what had killed him, they had no idea, his body was washed, and then they started cutting off his hair. And they gave samples of his hair to many people. And this book, Beethoven's Hair, follows one of these locks of hair, all the way from when it's put in a locket and presented as a gift to one of his students, to when it is sold at Sotheby's, and then in the 1990s, and then DNA testing is put on it. From it we learn Beethoven did not have syphilis, which many people thought. We also learn that he had lead poisoning. Beethoven drank from pewter tankards in the pubs that he went to because the pewter tankards were not breakable and they unfortunately contained lead. He also drank lots of fortified wine that also contained lead. So more than likely, Beethoven died of lead poisoning. So now getting back to the Ode to Joy where we started. Beethoven began composing his Ninth Symphony in 1822 and finished it in 1824. He worried a lot about the last movement because it had to be special. It had to be a dramatic, different thing. And he came up with the idea of setting that poem, the Ode to Joy, as a choral movement, which had never, ever happened in a symphony before. The poem celebrates the universal brotherhood of mankind. At its premiere in 1824, Beethoven was not allowed to be the conductor because he could no longer really hear well enough to follow the scores and things, but he was allowed to be on stage so that he could help the musicians do the dynamics and the style of performance he wanted. One musician wrote, He stood in front of the conductor's stand and threw himself back and forth like a madman. At one moment, he stretched to the front and to his full height, and at the next, he crouched down to the floor, and he flailed about with his hands and feet as though he wanted to play all the instruments and sing all the chorus parts. The conductor, however, had told the musicians, disregard anything he does. When the symphony ended, Beethoven remained facing the orchestra and could not hear the thunderous applause from the audience. And then Carolyn Unger, the mezzo-soprano soloist, tapped him on the shoulder and turned him around so that he could see the crowd's response. To Beethoven, the Ode to Joy symbolized the ideals of freedom and equality and brotherhood and the fraternity of man. It also symbolized his triumph over the diversities of his life. The melody to the Ode to Joy has been used many times. In 1972, it was adopted as the Anthem of Europe by the Council of Europe. And in 1974, it became Rhodesia's national anthem with new words in the title, Rise, O Voices of Rhodesia. In 1989, it was played during the protests in Tiananmen Square in China. And in 1989, it was performed by Leonard Bernstein on Christmas Day after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Often when it is played now, they replace Ode to Joy with Ode to Freedom. So it has been played during many victory speeches and performed by the Orchestra for Peace. And in unity, we sing, Joyful, joyful, we adore thee, and we play it at weddings. Thank you.